Hey guys, so we're going to go through chapter 9 and chapter 10. I just want to note to you that when I typically teach these two chapters, I use notes, not PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to post these notes so that you can see them yourself, that I'm going to use to kind of guide us through these two chapters. I'm going to try to use the PowerPoint slides as I go through them. It may seem a little bit confusing as I do that. That's just because I'm used to using the whiteboard to go through these two chapters. But it should still work out. It'll just be a little bit of skipping around. This is the important stuff, though. The stuff that we're going to talk about here. You'll have all these notes, and we'll also kind of walk through it now. Okay, so one of the things that we haven't covered yet is the fact that there's different views on macroeconomics. I kind of discussed that already, but the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model that we just discussed is used by different variants, if you want to think of them, different ideologies to prove different thoughts on macroeconomics. The first section of people we're going to discuss in chapter 9 is classical economics. We're going to talk about classicals, people called neoclassicals, and even people who are considered to be Austrian economists. Basically, an easier way of calling them is self-regulators, like people who believe in a self-regulating economy. You can think of these guys as very free market. So they give you a quick definition of classical economists. You can go ahead and read that. I typically start off by talking about this guy named Jean-Baptiste Say, who lived in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he really kind of introduced this thought process on what causes long-term economic problems. Are long-term economic problems caused by low consumer demand? Is it demand that creates the problem? Or is it kind of more of a function of supply and production? It's kind of a chicken or the egg type of problem. What is it? Is it demand that creates recessionary issues, or is it supply? And he came up with this thought that supply creates its own demand. In other words, production creates demand sufficient to purchase all goods and services produced. In other words, to kind of back up a little bit, the iPhone, or what was the predecessor to the iPhone, the iPod, wasn't demanded until it was produced. So he kind of comes across that way. He says that production creates the demand. So the implications of this are that Say's law says that there cannot be an overproduction of goods, where supply in the economy is greater than demand in the economy, or a general underproduction of goods, where demand in the economy is greater than supply. Neither of the above say that production can't change. It's saying that supply and demand should find an equilibrium. He's saying prosperity can be increased by stimulating production, not consumption. Now, the slides go through a quick example in a barter economy, so I'll just read this out to you. This law is most easily understood in terms of a barter economy. Consider a person baking bread in a barter economy. The baker is the supplier of bread. According to Say, the baker works at his trade because he plans to demand other goods. As he is baking bread, the baker is thinking of the goods and services he will obtain in exchange for it. Thus, his act of supplying bread is linked to his demand for other goods. In other words, supply creates that own demand. If supplying some goods leads to simultaneous demand for other goods, then Say's law implies that there cannot be an overproduction of goods or an underproduction of goods, as we've already mentioned. On the other hand, if the baker is baking bread in a money economy, does Say's law still hold? Basically, he's saying the reason we have money is to buy stuff, and that's it. I think they're going to get into this in just a second here. Yeah, here we go. If we have a drop in consumption and savings increases, economic forces are at work to create an equal increase in investment. So, let's back up. If people spend less, they consume less, that means they have more money available. So typically, they're going to put more into their savings accounts or save in some sort of way. And the thought here is that he's saying that should result in an equal increase in investment. So basically, he's implying that savings, the money in the savings account, is then used. For example, if you invest in stocks, that money would be used by the firms. I typically draw out at this point a supply and demand chart with the interest rate here, just like this, and dollars saved or invested here on this axis. And classical economists believe that interest rates are able to adjust or flexible. So if savings increased, in this case, you have an increase here of savings, that would result in a shift in the supply of this blue curve to the purple curve, which would lower that interest rate. As you can see, the interest rate declines here, and increase the investment. Basically, this says if one has money, it's irrational to hoard it. They will save it, and it will be invested. And because of that, it's funneled back into the economy via loans. So that's the underlying point here. I'd encourage you to read through these slides if you'd like. We're not going to get into all this, but I do want to get through a couple more points on Say's law. Say's law and classical economists believe that in the flexibility of wages and prices. And many believe that the central bank or the Fed's role is to limit inflation. Austrian economists, this is stuff that I typically write up on the board or talk to the students about. Austrian economists could be lumped in here too, but they differ in the fact that they believe that the Fed causes booms and busts through interest rates. Low interest rate policy can cause a boom, and when the interest rates start to rise again, it may cause a bust. In order to understand these things further, I'm going to keep moving through here. We need to understand the three states of the economy. And the first state of the economy is a long-run equilibrium. I believe that's what they're going to cover first. No, they actually cover recessionary gap first here. Okay, so we're going to cover the recessionary or contractionary gap first. And this is a condition where real GDP is less than the natural rate of real GDP, and the unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. So, in a sense, the way to remember what a recessionary gap is the short-run equilibrium is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. That's when you're in a recessionary gap. In other words, to think about this more or less theoretically, you are not meeting your potential. The green line's your potential. That's where you want to be. And you're to the left of it. And as we all know, this line indicates that you want to have really high real GDP, right? But you're all the way over here. So you're in a recession. You should be here in the short run, but you're not. So that's a situation where the unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, and real GDP is lower than the natural rate of real GDP. You can read through that at your leisure. The inflationary gap is the opposite, where you're overheating in a sense. Your economy is here in the short run, and you should be here. So in a sense, you're growing too fast in an inflationary gap. So this is the condition where real GDP in the economy is producing at a rate greater than natural real GDP, and the unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. Remember we said 4% or something like that is the natural rate of unemployment? Well, this would be a situation where you're producing it with 2% unemployment. That's too low. You want to slow down your economy or your economic expansion. So you can read through that. We've already discussed the long-run equilibrium. That's a point at which the short-run equilibrium and the long-run equilibrium both equal one another. I don't believe, I'm just going to check something, see if they have a chart on that. It doesn't look like they do have a chart on that. But I encourage you to read about the long run equilibrium so that you understand that. The next thing they introduce here in this chapter is physical and institutional production possibilities frontiers. A physical production possibility frontier illustrates combinations of goods the economy can produce given physical constraints of finite resources or current states of the economy. So this is just like the PPF that we've dealt with in the past, the physical PPF. The institutional PPF, and I have no idea why these slides print underneath the charts. I apologize about that. These are the slides that go with the book. The institutional PPF illustrates combinations of goods that the economy can produce given the physical constraints of finite resources, current state of technology, and institutional constraints. So the new point here is that if you recall back to the PPF curves, we said, you have to produce, let's just say we're at this blue line. You can produce, guns and butter, or good Y and good X. And you can choose any point along this line, but you can't get out to this purple line. You'd love to, but you can't. If that's the case and you want to get out to here, you have to have an increase in technology, increase in finite resources, or in this case, in the institutional PPF, you may be able to expand your institutional constraints. A better example for this is, let's say you're on this purple line, okay, instead, and you can choose any point along this purple line, or you could actually choose within the purple line. So at point D right here, if the economy is here, then the unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. You should be producing, in other words, out on this purple line. Institutional constraints is referring to kind of like government type constraints, like stuff like the DMV and that sort of thing, where they're not operating on profit. So maybe they have some, a lot of organizations, not just the government, but a lot of organizations, including places where you may work, have institutional constraints set up that kind of is red tape and stuff like that, if you ever heard of that term, or bureaucratic. And it's not easy to have efficiency. So that's what institutional constraints are referring to. So maybe if you have institutional constraints, you can no longer produce at this purple line. You're actually in here at this institutional PPF. That's the point of this. And this is going to be important because the self-regulators, which this whole chapter is about, they're kind of introducing a few models to talk about what they want to talk about. But they're going to believe that, government in general kind of messes things up. That's what they're going to say. So whenever they're involved in this stuff, we're not producing enough because we have all these institutional constraints associated with anything. Okay, you can take a look at that on your own. Oh, they do have long-run equilibrium. Here is the long-run equilibrium. It's a situation where the short-run equilibrium and the long-run equilibrium intersect. Let's see how much longer we have in this chapter. We only have a few more things. Hopefully we can get through it here. I just don't want this timer to run out on me. Okay. Self-regulating economy. Once again, this is all about the self-regulators. What would they advocate if you were in this situation or kind of a recessionary gap? What would they say to